My name's Paul Mitchell. I'm a professor at the Canadian Forces College. I've spent a lot of that time. I was the first academic at the Canadian Forces College. I joined the staff in 1998. So that was the beginning of sort of a real interesting academic revolution that was taking place in PME, professional military education, in Canada at the time. And we now have a department of 13 academics at the college. And I've spent most of my career at the college being the director of academics. I just stood down as the director of academics, and that position is largely responsible for overseeing academic standards and quality, as well as the sort of strategic relations between different universities and other PME institutes across North America and in the international arena. I've got a background in naval studies, and I guess I have the distinction of having introduced design education into the Canadian Forces College. And those who are familiar with me are familiar with my stumbling into design article, which was really just about the serendipitous discovery of design. And how it came to be introduced into the Canadian Forces College, and some of the issues that we had to wrestle with in that introduction. That's a tough question. I'm not a designer by background. Because, and that's as I was hinting at with the stumbling over issue was really, I knew nothing about design, but I did have a problem with curriculum, a curriculum problem issue in terms of trying to understand. Our issue there was trying to figure out why were military operations not as successful as they had been historically, and what was wrong with the toolkit that the Canadian Forces was employing in Afghanistan at the time, and that's when I stumbled on the design issue. So if I were to say I think first I would start, where is my island in the archipelago, and my island is probably on the edges of the archipelago, looking over at the others. It has. This island perhaps is marked by a state of chaos and confusion on the island in terms of trying to understand what is going on, and noting that the other islands seem to have some interesting ideas and approaches about how to solve some of the class problems that we're experiencing on my island. And so perhaps I have a telescope that's looking over to the other islands in the archipelago, trying to see what they're doing and learn from their experience and try to implement some of those solutions to address some of the problems that we're experiencing on our island. Well, again, that's interesting because, again, I'm coming at it from outside of the discipline or the field, I guess would be a better way of putting it. I would be very I'm very encouraging of young people getting into different academic pursuits, and design seems to be. I think a key skill for the 21st century. Everything around us has been designed for a particular purpose, and yet so many of our systems are in chaos right now and failing. And sometimes that's because of the nature of complexity and the butterfly effects that are beyond anybody's control to foresee or to forestall. But sometimes that's also due to spectacularly bad design as well. And so I think in many ways design is a key skill for the 21st century because so many of our systems are experiencing disruption and experiencing unexpected results and substandard results that weren't what the designers were aiming for. And we're going to need to try and fix those things and find out what's going on. Just as science and engineering are so important to our society, I think design is similarly a key skill that everybody really needs to have some facility in understanding what it is and how it can be used even in our own lives. We design everything sort of on a very natural basis, and I think the advantage of a design background is that it allows you to surface the things that human beings do naturally as human beings, which is design things and create things. And so it enables us to do those things better. And that's the way that I pitch this to my students. It's not the military students that I have. It's not that this is something that's entirely new. Militaries have always been engaged in design. It's just that they've done so very reflexively, in a very tacit manner. So a design background or some form of design education allows you to think critically about how you approach design and how you can be a better designer in the things that you do, either professionally or even indeed in your everyday life. We at Canadian Forces College, we developed something called agnostic design, and the elevator pitch here is that there are many different approaches to doing design, and what we aim to do at the Canadian Forces College is to expose our students to as many different types of design as we can in the course of the 10 months that we have them, so that they have a better understanding of the field as a way of thinking about problems rather than a process explicitly for solving problems, so that they have more than just one tool in their toolkit, more than just planning. Planning is extremely important, but planning without design can often go disastrously awry. And indeed, only one form of design can create some spectacularly badly designed artifacts as well. And so really what we're trying to do is open up the minds of our students to the complexity of the world around them, and the challenge of actually devising solutions so that they don't leap to solving the problem before they actually understand what it is that they're confronting. So it's fascinating. As we, because we have this agnostic approach, we brought in a lot of civilian design experts, people without a lot of military experience or any military experience in their approach to design. And when we introduced ourselves and told them what we were doing, and they came to see some of the things and how we were doing them at the college, they went away rather amazed that I never really, the common reference was, I didn't realize that we could use design for these sorts of problems. And they were kind of amazed that that the military was engaged in some of these. And once they understood, they understood why the military is particularly interested in this type of approach. With the civilian designers, we experienced sort of an aha moment or a moment of discovery for themselves, that there is this world that they hadn't thought about in terms of how design is being applied. On the military side, one of the things that I think, again, that is unique to the Canadian Forces College is again, this agnostic approach. So in the United States, what they've tried to do is formalize the design process so that it can be applied by easily by people without a lot of education in terms of what it is. And so they've reduced it down to a set of linear steps. And it's interesting because a lot of designers look at that and say this is actually antithetical to a lot of the objectives of design because it becomes a linear process rather than an exploratory, open, open way of looking at the world. And I would say again, that we are unique in the area of PME in exploring not just the complexity of the problem space, but also the different ways that it can be addressed using the different tools that design and other sort of creative problem-solving techniques bring to that particular aspect. So I think Canadian Forces College is a special location in the world of design because we've tried to resist the natural tendency of the military to make everything into a doctrine, into something that can be trained to people, as opposed to something that requires education to understand. That kind of limits there are pluses and minuses. On the one hand, the plus is that our students have an open approach to it and can explore and discover new ways of doing things. On the other hand, it's not for everybody because it remains somewhat a bit mysterious in terms of how this is actually done. And so for those who are on the fence or who may not be entirely convinced that it's necessary, sometimes our approach is a little bit, is a bit of a barrier. And that's something that my colleagues and I are trying to address in future iterations as we evolve our approach, is to how to make the design process less mysterious, more easily applicable to those who don't have a extensive design education, and yet at the same time preserve the openness and the freedom of choice that we think the agnostic approach affords those who apply it. So as I keep saying, I don't have a formal design background, and yet what I think was really interesting in encountering design and beginning to work it into my curriculum, and beyond just simple courses, work it into program level development as when I became the director of academics, was realizing how I was doing design myself in a very tacit sense, that I wouldn't have been able to formally articulate a model of design, and yet that iterative process of constantly going back and re-examining your initial assumptions and testing them against reality, and doing focused investigations with the people who are actually using the designs that I'm employing in the context of my curriculum, was something that I had a design loop built right into my own sort of bespoke curriculum design process, and so I think that was really interesting discovery for me, and it helped me to articulate to military officers why they shouldn't be concerned about this supposedly novel idea of design, that in fact it was very likely they had been designers themselves throughout their entire professional career, but were entirely unaware of it. It's like that famous line, that about somebody was, who was amazed to find out that they'd been speaking prose all their life, because they didn't have the language or the concepts to frame what it was that they were doing. They were completely unaware that they were actually doing it. And so the example that I love to give in terms of this is the military operations that all the armies involved in World War I were engaged in between, I would say, the spring of 1915 And basically, maybe the fall of 1917 is a gigantic battle laboratory where the opposing military forces are trying to find out how to do operations in modern industrialized conditions with lots of long-range heavy artillery and overhead spotting and aircrafts and novel ways of doing map, and all kinds of new scientific innovations are coming in terms of military technology. Radios are beginning to appear on the battlefield. And so there's a lot of changes in terms of command and control and movement and logistics and the industrialized nature of our economies, and all of these sorts of things all begin to impact the battlefield and create those terrible conditions on the Western Front. And they pop up very early in 1915. And it isn't until the end of 1917 that militaries begin to understand how to deal with those circumstances. And so for me, it's to go back to those moments and say they were doing design at that particular moment. They weren't doing it explicitly in following a design process from the D School or from Bauhaus or, from any of the other, anything that we would recognize as a particular approach that is used by corporations or by militaries today. But they definitely were doing design. And so, again, I always come back to both in my own recognition that I was doing design and then being able to see previous examples of design, even in an in a very tacit sense, like the period between 1915 and 1917, as a way of saying to people who are fearful that what we're doing is corrupting military thinking in a particular way, because there is a lot of concern that design is a mistake, that is just a fad, that, it's an airport business novel fad type of thing. That it's not, that human beings by their nature are designers. We designed, as Harold Nelson says, we designed fire. We didn't discover it. We designed fire. Fire allowed us to design many other things like cooking and how we protect ourselves from the elements and many other different, how we light our surroundings and so on and so forth. We found many uses for fire, and that was all a design process as well. And so it's something that humans do from the very beginning. They became humans. In fact, probably humans before they were humans were doing design as well. That's just the nature of our large brains. And so I think that's the interesting thing in terms of my approach. In terms of the way that I've done it is always been trying to reassure people that this isn't some sort of magic bullet. It's something that they do every day. What we're trying to do is actually help them do it better by making that process of thinking more explicit so that they can reflect on it as they do it. Well, that's a tricky question. Of all the ones, that's probably the trickiest, because my future plans are probably less to do with design and more getting back to my academic roots, which were always involved in naval strategy and naval technology. And I'm currently doing a major research project on the acquisition of the Victoria-class submarines in Canada, which, for those non-Canadians, is an incredibly controversial military project that's been has a very bad narrative, undeservedly so, I think. And so I'm looking at that particular thing, and there's actually some interesting design problems within it, but the book is more about those sorts of things. The other part that I think this question makes it tricky is about the the future and hope and right now, I'm sorry, I fall into the pessimist camp on many particular things. I think, as I said, design is going to be a critical skill for us moving forward in navigating some of the ecological problems that we're going to be confronting as a species, some of the political problems that we are going to confront as a nation. And in terms of the politics and how we relate to other countries is going to be design will be a critical thing for us to think our way through. And I hope that that we do design our systems better than what we've done so in the past. Canada, in particular, I think has got a hard road to travel on in the coming years as the international environment becomes a little bit more hostile to some of the values and interests that Canada has traditionally projected since the end of the Second World War. Our natural partners in Europe and elsewhere are becoming more fractious, and it will be more difficult to work with them collectively. And then, of course, the developments that are taking place in the United States are tremendously worrisome, I think, as Canadians looking south and seeing growing levels of instability with our biggest and most important partner. And all of that will require us to think very, very carefully about what it is we're trying to do strategically, and how we relate to the United States, and how the changes that are taking place in the United States are going to impact our ability to project the kinds of interests and values that we've traditionally pursued for the last, well, literally 100 years, I would say. So yeah, tricky question. I don't have a lot of, unfortunately, I don't have a lot of optimism in terms of what we're going to be confronting. But there is, I suppose, always hope that we can with clear sight, we may be able to design our way through that very challenging period that I think we're going to be confronting in the next 50 years or so. I think I'll start with the common misconception, and I'll start, right from the common misconception that I encounter the most with the military is that it is a replacement for planning. And for me, design and planning go hand in hand, that they have to be interactive and support one another, that you don't do design and then you do planning. That in fact that it's something that sloshes back and forth between a design between design inquiry and planning efforts, and that's a tough message sometimes, because a plan is really regarded as some sort of stable artifact by the military, that once it's been written, it is cast in stone, and it is dangerous to go back and re-examine it. And I think actually the opposite is true, that it is the failure to go back and re-examine the plan as the facts change on the ground that causes the source of much of the misfortune that Western militaries have encountered in the past 20 years or in the past 30 years. That they have dogmatically stuck with rigid plans and have failed to take account at how the environment is changing around them, and just hoping that things will get back to normal, as it were, when in fact that they're not, that the normal, how we define normal, has shifted entirely, and that they've failed to keep up with how those forces are shifting. And so design has to be very, very interactive with planning. You can't, you can come up with a great design, but if you can't articulate it into a plan, then it doesn't matter how great the idea is, it's never going to get implemented. And that's the other problem on the other side, that it's that interaction of how you go from a design phase into a planning phase that I think is itself somewhat mysterious, and fraught with peril, I would argue. I mean, and this isn't something that I think is just a problem with the military. You can see this in industry, and in the public service and other service industries or what have you, of great designs that were never implemented, often to the detriment of the company that developed them. Kodak is a lesson right there, in terms of its development of digital photography, which it then is undone by that very development because it wasn't able to re-articulate how that company was going to be able to continue to move forward, because it believed it was so tied up to the production of film. And ultimately, went through a spectacular collapse. Blockbuster Video, in terms of how online streaming was shaping the industry again, and those particular things. I think that shift between the conceptual design and how are we going to implement that, and what does that mean for the company, or what does that mean for the organization is probably, I like to say, in the military, it's the $64,000 question about how well that is done. And honestly, I think from an industrial level, it's always difficult to translate that, the industrial experience into the military experience. But there's a lot of mystery still in terms of how that's done effectively. Yeah, actually, and design is really critical here in this regard. In the article on stumbling into design at CFC, about 2 years into what I still refer to as the experiment of the introduction of design into our curriculum, we had a group of senior officers on what we call the National Security Program, which is our War College level program at CFC. And they had heard some initial discontent from the previous year's group of students about the whole design approach. And partway through the course that I was leading, that was introducing design to them, there was a rebellion. And they basically said, we don't think the approach that you are using is fit for professional military education. We think it is overly academic. We think that it is a waste of time, and we're not going to do it. And they actually, there was a small group of them that basically said, we're not going to do what you've asked us to do on the exercise that was employing design. They went back to their standard planning technique, and one of our retired 3-star general officers actually supported them in this particular move. The other 2 did not, but the one did. And for me, that was one of my low points, professionally speaking. Right in the middle of a course, I had a group of very, very senior students basically call me out and say, what I was doing was unprofessional and a little bit silly. And that I needed to, they weren't going to follow the curriculum that I had laid out for them. In terms of overcoming that, I basically let them get away with it because there was no point in digging in my heels. It would just make the moment worse. And so I acquiesced. But after the course was finished, I was able to sit down with one of the retired 3-stars who had remained supportive of me. And he said to me, okay, now we need to figure out what happened and why it happened and what we can do to make things better the next time around. And it wasn't about getting rid of design. It was about, okay, how are we teaching it? And what is causing the students to experience these levels of frustration? It would be easy to arrive at that there are just a bunch of blockheads, who refuse to change. They're very conservative. thinkers, and they just simply don't want to deal with a different way of thinking or a different way of working their way through problems. But what we tried to do we tried to be a bit more empathetic to their positions and understand the insecurities that they might be feeling confronting these new ideas, and how could we introduce these things more effectively so that it wasn't as threatening. And we, between the two of us, with some support from another of my academic colleagues, we redesigned the course. And so this is an interesting data point that we have with this very significant rebellion that's taken place. Clearly, we need to do something about that to fix things. But what is it that we need to fix? And so we went back to first principles. We looked at the course. We tore it apart. We reorganized it in particular things. We dropped a bunch of things that we had been doing and introduced a whole series of new activities. And the following year, I had just the opposite. That I went from the zero to the hero. I was made the honorary graduate of the program. Every year, the colonels award this a person as they nominate a person as an honorary graduate, as somebody who's had the most impact on their thinking during the course. And I was very pleased to be nominated that year, because the previous year they were ready to fire me. And then the following year, after what we'd done, I got this accolade from the same group. Well, not the same people, but the same group of people. The following year. So I think it just illustrates that notion of plans and design and the interactivity that a course outline, a curriculum, is a plan for how to do something. And I could have dug in my heels and said, no, they're a bunch of blockheads. They who just refuse to see reality in front of them. But instead, I took the opportunity to think about it hard, think about the frustrations they were having as students, bring in, how do you approach people who are conservative in terms of their thinking about change, and what you think may be the need for change, but they may see as the need for, like I might have, as staying the course. How do you work that into so that you don't get these sorts of rebellious movements taking place within your student body? It's a different problem, I think, that most design programs face, because unlike, if somebody's going to OCAD or the Rhode Island School of Design or something like that, they produce graduates and they go out and they do, and that's it. Maybe they send a bequest in as, to support their programs later on as alumni or what have you. But by and large, there isn't a lot of interactivity. Our students later become our bosses. They go on to higher rank, and then they have to make decisions that affect us as an institution. So we have to pay really close attention to what it is that we're teaching them in a way that, they go away and without the thinking that there's something seriously wrong with Canadian Forces College and we've got to do something about it because I had a bad experience as a student. It's a bit of a different problem than a university or a design school, I think, faces in terms of that. Medical schools, law schools, they might go through something similar to this in terms of the law societies and medical associations and so on and so forth. But it is an interesting problem that we face from time to time at CFC. Overall, I am amazed at what Canadian Forces College has become since I joined the staff in 1998. And I won't say that it's all because of me. I was a cog in that process of change that's taken place. But there has been a dramatic change that I've been very pleased to be part of and to witness. When I joined the college in 1998 as the very first academic, I always say that it was like a virus invading the body. All the antibodies came out, and basically I was told, you go sit in that corner and you can, attend to all the things that you want, but just sit over there and be quiet. You're here at the behest of the organization, not because we've requested you, was the subtle message that was given to me when I arrived. In fact, my very first boss sort of wagged his finger at me on the very first day and said, remember who you're working for, Mitchell, because you're not at a university anymore. You're at a staff college, and a staff college is not a university. And so it wasn't a very welcoming environment. I was happy to have a job, to be quite honest, because the job situation was, as it remains today, precarious for most young academics. But over time, I was able to make small changes to things, and people would say, oh, that makes a lot of sense. We really like what you've done. Would you take a look at this thing over here and see whether you can help here? And those things began to build upon each other and established an environment wherein the college saw the need to have more academic support. And so the thing that I would say that I have had a significant impact on in terms of this overall revolution that I'm describing has been in consistently pushing for adequate academic support for the programs that we run at CFC, and building the department into something bigger than what it was. It started out with me. We recruited another academic, then we recruited two more. We got a fifth one. I went away on sabbatical. When I came back, there'd been three more that had been added, and we've been progressively growing the department to the level that we're now at 13. And we probably will be growing again in the next 2 or 3 years by another 3 or 4 academics. And all of that has really revolutionized the college in a way that, in 1998, it was go sit in the corner and be quiet, to now where the staff, at least, and the students at CFC understand the role that we're playing. And we've gone from being the virus in the body to actually being incorporated into the cell itself. So the other metaphor I like is the notion of the mitochondria in a cell, which is the powerhouse. And that was originally a separate bacteria that existed on its own. The mitochondria has its own DNA. And it was incorporated into the cell, something alien brought in to help the cell work better. And that's the way I look at it, is that the college is the cell, and the academics themselves are like the mitochondria, that the outsider that has come in and it has made that place function at a higher level, at a higher capacity than what it could have done just on its own. There's a long road still to proceed on this, because academics are not of the professional body of the group that they are educating. We are all civilians. We don't have there have been a few in the past that have military experience, but they've mostly retired. We try to hire civilians because we want that outside expertise and those outsider perceptions, because that's what we're there to do, is challenge the military in the way that it thinks, ask those questions that require them to reflect on why they do things in a particular way. And maybe they can articulate them better, and maybe they don't. And they say, gee, I never thought about it that way. Maybe we should do things differently. And I think that's really what our role is not to tell them how to do their job. It's to ask those tough questions to see if they have good answers to why they do their job in particular ways. And so when I look back at the almost 24 years that I've been working at the college, it is with a sense of how we've gone from that organization where the academics were just in a corner to one where we become central to it, and we've really begun to change how the military think about their job and about how it could be done differently. The kinds of things that the Canadian Forces are confronting, particularly the the sexual misconduct crisis that is going on and plays out daily, almost it seems, on the headlines of our major newspapers, is precisely the sort of thing where I think designing is very, very important in addressing the kinds of challenges at the leadership and the command level, in terms of how do we treat people, how do we give people the kind of professional experience that they're craving when they join the Canadian Forces, and how do we relate to a diverse body of people coming into the Canadian Forces outside of the traditional white Anglo-Saxon male, buttressed by a few white, Quebecois males who join. How do we bring in people who are not your traditional recruits to the Canadian Forces, who want to contribute, who are interested in serving, our great nation, but are put off by the way that service is currently being demanded of them, or not even being welcomed in terms of their desire to serve. It's not entirely unlike me arriving in 1998 and being told to sit in the corner, when people from diverse backgrounds, people from, different genders, come in and say, I want to serve my country, and being told, no, you're not the person we're looking for. We're looking for that white male Anglo-Saxon or Quebecois appearance, and you don't really fit. And yet that group that we've traditionally recruited are ones where recruiting is crashing. We can't rely on those people to maintain the numbers that we have in the Canadian Forces. So we have to be much more open and diverse if the Canadian Force is going to survive in terms of the size of it. That's a great design question, I think. And it's one that we've been quietly saying, think about it like this. Don't jump to a plan. Don't jump to a set of orders. Don't jump to an operation like Op Honor. That was a knee-jerk reaction, an approach that was very comfortable for the Canadian Forces to do, and yet has not had any of the kinds of impacts that it sought to achieve. It was poorly designed, is the way that I would put it. And so going back to those design approaches and thinking about it from that perspective, I think is incredibly important. And I would like to say, I'd like to think that what we're doing at CFC is laying the seed corn amongst our graduates for different approaches that enables those kinds of things to be more successful in the future, so that we can change the way that we do the business of the Canadian Forces, and we can make it more inclusive and reflective of the changes in the population that Canada has gone through in the last 30 years or so. A lot of it has reflected in the sort of my pessimistic outlook in many ways. I think it's been very fascinating to watch how something like this virus has affected things like supply chains, for example. The problem that is being experienced, in Long Beach and with the stacking up of shipping containers, and because there's a shortage of drivers, because there's a shortage of people, and that's due to a couple of other unrelated things, and all of that ripples out and creates other problems, so that people can't buy cars, they can't get their houses built in the time that they want, and that creates more problems, and so the whole series of butterfly effects that have come about because of COVID, and the implications of that, in ways that I don't think anybody could really have foretold. Some people may have been, but the radicalization of our politics, and it's not just in the United States, but we see it in Canada as well. We see it in Britain. We see it across Europe. We see it beginning in Asia. as well. All of these sorts of things, I think, are tied into the disruptions that COVID has caused our societies. And that is, I think, the thing that makes me a little bit pessimistic about our ability to, I say that design is going to be absolutely crucial for the 21st century, and I fundamentally believe that. But I also believe that the political disruptions that we're seeing on a global basis right now are going to make the ability for us to design our solutions better, more challenging. When we can't cooperate on things like masks and vaccinations, which are in many ways a lot less invasive than the kinds of things that we're going to have to do to address climate change in the future, or the way that we're going to have to cooperate in order to address the growing problems that we see in the information sphere, whether it's misinformation, whether it's from hacking, whether it's from radicalization that's taking place in growing number. I mean, we used to worry about radicalization, its impact on our immigrants from particular areas of the world, and now we have to worry about everybody. It isn't just limited to a particular group. We can design a problem for that group. We can do how do you de-radicalize an entire country when it's 300 million people? All of those things, I think, COVID has made me reflect on why those things have popped up at this particular point in time. But it also gives me a profound set of pessimism about our ability to design our way out of it, irrespective of the fact that I continue to believe that is the skill that we're going to need to try and figure out how we do that. When you have, 70 million Americans who believe that, that the election was fraudulently stolen from them in a particular way, that's a gigantic design question for how you run your next election. How do you make sure? And are some of those solutions ones that have a negative impact on other voters, the ones that do believe that the elections are being run? And then how does that, how does the stuff that's taking place to the south of us in Canada, affect our own electoral dynamics and the rise of the People's Party and Maxime Bernier and those sorts of things? I look at that and I say, well, that those sorts of sentiments that are animating the people who are attracted to that party are fed in many ways by the same sorts of things that are feeding Trumpism, that are feeding Brexit, that are feeding the rise in populism and authoritarianism in Eastern Europe, in a variety of other locations around the world. And so, again, COVID has been an interesting opportunity because we've all had to stay at home and do our jobs differently, if we were lucky enough to be able to do our jobs differently, and reflect on what is going on around us. And I think it is fascinating on the one hand, and it is also a little bit worrisome in terms of looking forward. It may be that we have to go through some hard seasons ahead. We are, to use my World War I analogy, we're in the spring of 1915, and we've got, we've got some hard struggles ahead of us to figure out how we design our systems to meet these emerging challenges. But because they come at us from so many different directions at this point, that's the bit that I am concerned of as a social scientist or as somebody who is looking at events going on around us.